now we're going to start with chapter 4, which is all about the motherboard and components of the motherboard, which is why this chapter is so big and it's almost all of second quarter, because the textbook incorporates everything about a motherboard as well as the CPU into components of the motherboard. It doesn't break out CPU into a different chapter. I'm actually looking at trying to get the newest version because we're on release 3 of the textbook and they're at release 6, and maybe I can at least get one to see if they've made some updates to that, because I think that shouldn't be combined. So this is what we're going to talk about and what our objectives are in the chapter. The motherboard is the most important part of our computer. It determines everything. We said that back in chapter 1 when we talked about form factors and introduced form factors. The form factor of the motherboard determines the case and the power supply. And really, the motherboard determines the kind of power supply input, and then the case determines the shape of the power supply. The motherboard determines the, most importantly, the speeds and type of CPU that you can use, okay? The motherboard has that form factor, and there are really 2 major components of the motherboard form factor. Number 1, the size and shape of it physically, what does it fit inside? And number 2, what things plug into it. And only one kind of CPU or one type of CPU plugs into a given motherboard. There's another one sitting here someplace. Where's my other one? Right? Okay, when I look at form factors of the motherboard, that CPU socket is one of the major ones. I don't know where the other CPU went. It was sitting right there. Last block.
And they put in
Do you see something else that looks just like this?
Let me see it.
And 2 CPUs got as well last block. I'll grab another one out of here. I'm sure. I'm quite positive it was Brighton. But if I look at this CPU and this CPU from this side, it looks very similar. But when I look at the bottom, one has pins and one does not. These 2 are not interchangeable because they have different CPU sockets. So the motherboard and the way it connects to the CPU determines the kinds of CPUs that we can put in it. So if we don't select the right motherboard for the CPU, or vice versa, the right CPU for the motherboard, they don't connect. It's like trying to put Legos and Duplos together. They may both be made by the same company, but they don't snap together. Okay? Motherboard also determines the expansion slots. What do we have going forward? When I buy this motherboard, I've got 4 expansion slots on here. You should be able, by the end of this chapter, to tell me what is that, what is that, what is that, what is that. I will have motherboard pictures and say, what kind of expansion slot is B? And they'll be matching, because I should be able to look at this and know that these are PCI and that's an AGP slot. Okay? And when I look at this one, I should be able to know that these are PCI, this is PCI1, and this is PCI X16 video card slot. And I know you don't know that right now, but that's one of the things you need to be able to know. So when I look at this motherboard, you should be able to tell what kind of things plug into it, because they determine what you're going to be able to do with it in the future. Okay? I can't, if I use this one, I cannot put any kind of current gaming video card into an AGP video card slot, but I can into a PCI Express video card slot. Okay? So if I don't have this kind of slot on my motherboard, I can't use it for gaming at all, unless that gaming is really, really old and crappy. Okay? So it had to be really, really old, right? Maybe your emulator for the, what are people putting on their laptops right now? It's an emulator for like Game Boy emulator thing.
Oh,
okay? That's really, really old, and it doesn't matter how bad your video card is. But you're not going to play any current game without a good PCI Express video card slot. So the motherboard we choose determines the types and numbers of expansion card slots. And you guys are going to be presenting us 3 different motherboards, and they're going to have different kind of expansion slots, because on one we don't care, we're just looking for cheap, and on the other end, the gamer end, we're looking for very definitive kinds of expansion slots. Okay? Motherboard determines the types of memory that I can plug into it. Okay? We've got 3 different kind of memory standards today, really 2 that are of use anymore, and those are DDR, DDR2, and DDR3. And this came out and has had a speed of between, what was the first one? I think it was 233 to 400 megahertz speed. And this one went from 400 to 800 megahertz, and this one went from 800. So I think right now the fastest is 2133 megahertz, and that's how many cycles per second. So you can see DDR, when they went to the next standard, picked up from that speed and then got faster, and then it picked up from that speed and got faster. And you can't plug one into another. They're totally different. Again, it's like Legos and Duplos. They look close, but they don't quite snap together, okay? Actually, it'd be more like Legos and Mega Bloks, okay? Don't quite snap together right? Of course, Mega Bloks don't snap together right at all. I've never bought anything. If you've ever bought Mega Bloks, the only thing you do with the Mega Bloks is to super glue and make it a permanent thing. Yeah. Because if you kids buy a Mega Bloks thing that puts a Mega Block chip, it's going to put it all together and it's going to go, they put it all together. It's terrible. They don't snap. That's why they're cheaper. That's 8 megabytes. Anyway, so they're good if you want to build it and glue it while you're doing it. Anyway, so we've got different memory standards that the kind of motherboard we choose determines which memory plugs in. And you can't plug the wrong one in, it won't work. And then we've already talked about this. It also obviously determines the kind of case we can get. We're dealing in this class, in this section, primarily with ATX form factor motherboards. Okay? So we're looking at ATX cases, but I've already said all these ones like this we got around the school are BTX, which means almost everything fits together except for the case. The motherboard won't screw in the case, but every other part is because they're flipped, remember what I said. So the motherboard is the first thing that we choose. So it's the first thing we do in this course as far as major parts, and then all of our rest of our presentations are built upon those motherboards we chose. So today we're getting an introduction, then we're going to do some touchy-feely stuff and take some motherboards out, put some motherboards in, just so you get a chance to touch, because I think a lot of students remember better textile-wise, and that's why I took the course, that's why I'm teaching the course. I don't just like getting PowerPoints all the time, that's no fun for me either. Okay, so when we look at a motherboard, we need to learn how to readily identify the parts of the motherboard. Now, this one's obviously all labeled for us. But again, when we talk about ATX, we've got the back panel connector stuff, okay? When I choose a motherboard, I may be very interested in what's on that back panel connector. Because if I've got a good network card on there, I don't have to buy another network card, right? I don't have to add an expansion one here. If I've got low video requirements, like work PC or a home PC, maybe I want video integrated so I don't have to buy a video card. If I have low sound requirements, this sound card may be fine. I have a 6-channel audio one. You'll see some of them that the sound connection here is twice as big as this. It's got 6-channel audio. And again, you don't have to buy another sound card. Let's see what else. That's about it on here. Oh, and how many USBs I'm going to use and I have on the motherboard. Might be something that I really, really care about. If I get one like this, and has 6 rear USBs, I may be okay altogether. And if I get that one, I may have to add more expansion onto it, get a PCI card that uses USB. So I'm really interested in what is on that back panel connector. And when you're shopping and looking at motherboards, don't just gloss by that. It's really important what things I get with it. I may not use them all. I may get this one and say, I'm going to put in a really good video card, so I really don't care about that. In fact, if I'm buying a high-end gamer one, I may not want integrated video at all. I may be looking for one that doesn't have that because I've already got allocated in my budget to buy the really high-end video card. But I want to pay attention to this back panel connector. Every ATX case, ATX motherboard goes back panel connector, CPU, and then memory. They all do. And if it's a mini ATX, that might be the whole motherboard right there. It's just those things. Okay. So the next thing there is the CPU socket. Okay. It's called a CPU socket. In other words, it's where the CPU plugs in. There's two major manufacturers of CPUs, and they use different kinds of sockets. Intel, which everybody knows about, big blue, everybody's seen the great dong, dong, dong. Okay, Intel inside, right? And all your laptops have Intels inside. That's an N, even though I came out like it was an M. And then AMD, and we're going to talk more about these two companies when we get to the section on CPUs. And tomorrow, I think, is when we're going to talk more about them. But Intel and AMD are the two major manufacturers of CPUs. And if your motherboard takes Intel, it does not take AMD. They are not interchangeable at all. They have whole different structures of how they process stuff. They're very close, but they're not the same. Intel actually got AMD into the business of making processors. They used to just be a memory company. And they were told by IBM, said, hey, you can't be the only game in town. We need somebody else to make processors. And they subcontracted out to AMD. And then later, IBM said, that's fine. You don't need to subcontract that out. And so they told AMD, hey, don't worry about it. We're not going to hire you anymore. But they had a long-term contract, and they sued them, and they had to pay them $2 billion. So AMD got in the market from Intel hiring them, and now they're their only competitor. Okay? So we got two different kinds of companies, and this is not hard and fast, but it's a 90% true rule. Intel uses a socket called LGA. Okay? LGA stands for land grid. This is the best way to write this. Array. Okay? It's flat. This is an LGA CPU. It's flat. Okay, whenever I look at a motherboard, I can immediately tell whether it's an LGA motherboard or not. And this is an LGA motherboard. Take this out, make it easier for myself. All LGA motherboards have this little hooky thing on it. Okay? And this is how easy it is to put in an LGA CPU. There's little notches. So there's little notches. I just line up the notches. Oh, by the way, I can't put it in wrong. The notches keep me from, it won't go in wrong. Okay? So I line up the notches, and I drop it in. It's in. I put a little cover on it. It'll snap me down. And I didn't snap me down. I didn't get this part over that part. How embarrassing. Okay. Okay, so I drop it in there. I apparently didn't get the cover closed when I did that. This closes on there, and then this catches that right there. There we go. Now it's in there. It's pretty fun. It never happened. So it goes in there. So if I see a picture like this with a little hook, it's LGA, and therefore, over 90% of the time, it is Intel. AMD has made an LGA socket before. We don't use them for the most part. We use a different socket. Intel used to use the other kind of socket, which I'm going to talk about next. But if it's LGA, I show you this picture on the test, and you can't read the processor on there, and I say, what kind of socket is this motherboard for, or what company is the motherboard socket for? The answer is Intel. You can tell again by the little hook. Okay. The other kind of socket is called a PGA socket, and that's today used almost completely by AMD, and that stands for pin grid array. Okay, and a PGA socket has a CPU that has pins on it. Okay? If there's pins on it, it's a PGA socket. PGA sockets are also called ZIF sockets. That stands for zero insertion force. This is definitely a test question, by the way. Zero insertion force is what a ZIF socket is. Okay, and it's a PGA. This one is PGA. PGA sockets all have a little lever arm on them. See a little lever arm? Maybe plastic, maybe metal, but they all have a lever arm like that. And watch while I move this lever arm. As I move the lever arm, do you see this right here move and the processor move just a smidgen? Can you see that? You can't see it? You can't see that moving? Yeah, just a little. Okay, so what it is, it's got two pieces of plastics in there that the holes are lined up. And when you move the lever, it goes like that. And it pinches the pins so that it can't come out. So when the lever arm is down, the CPU can't come out. And when the lever arm is up, the CPU falls out very easily. Okay? It's called zero insertion force because the way you're supposed to put it in, and you have to make sure you line it up right. There's a little triangle right there on the pin. See the triangle in the corner? You line up that triangle with a little triangle on the ZIF socket. There's a little triangle right there. And it should just set on there, fall right in with no pressure at all, zero force. And then I just hold it down while I put the lever arm down, and now it's locked in. Okay, that's a PGA socket, and today it's used almost completely by AMD. This happens to be an Intel one because it's old, because everybody used to be PGA. Everybody was PGA until Intel came out with the LGA socket, and they have switched completely to LGA. So when I say, I'm talking about today's processors, not historically. When I say, if you see this one, and it'll be a new one, not one that's 10 years old, if it has a ZIF socket, it's AMD. Okay? You'll see that on the test, guaranteed. Okay, so I've got those sockets that determine, by the way, there's not just LGA and PGA, there's LGA 775, there's an LG, hold on, I'm going to show it to you. I didn't show this last class, but I should have. In fact, I think it's, I went to it. There we go. Okay, so these are all these sockets that have been out through history, okay? We're going to go to the end. By the way, the green are AMD and the blue are Intel. So, Intel started LGA back with the LGA 775 right here, okay, in 2004, okay? And ever since then, most of their sockets have been LGA sockets. You can see they had this one too, but it's a server socket that you never see. And then there's the LGA 1266. And if we go down to currently, now we're on the LGA 1248, 1567, 1155, 2011. Okay. And by the way, the number means how many little connectors there are on the bottom. So the LGA 1567 has 1,567 connections on the bottom of that CPU. Okay? So if this one, by the way, is an LGA 775, if this LGA 775 has 775 dots, we'll let Bryce count them later on today. We'll let him count them later on today. If this has 775 connections, then this one has 1,567 connections. Would this one therefore work in that socket even if it fit? No. Okay? They're not interchangeable. Every single year, someone presents a motherboard and a CPU that do not go together. Every single year. I would love it if this year was the year no one did that. Somebody would go and say, oh, I've got a LGA 2011 motherboard for my gamer thing, blah, 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 and this is my CPU I chose. Good, it's an LGA 1567, and everybody in the class goes like this, and he's like, what? That won't work together. Because your job, by the way, is to find it before I do. When things don't work together, you guys should be going, that won't work.
It'll be
okay.
No.
So, has to be the same socket. Just because they're both Intel doesn't mean it's going to work. It's 775 pins, 2011 pins. no worky, even if it fits, okay? So you have to make sure that when you pick your motherboard, and you guys are gonna pick motherboards first, that you're not going and picking for your gamer CPU an LGA 775 socket. Because if you do, you're not going to be able to put a new processor in. You're going to have to buy an old crappy processor, which may be perfectly fine for your home PC, because it's about cheap for your home PC, but it's not about cheap on your gamer PC. So if you're not picking one of these that has come out sometime in the last few years, then you're not going to buy a processor that works. It's come out in the last few years. So that's why this is a link for you guys when you get to the CPU section. But I'm going to open it up right now. It really is something you should look at when you're looking at your motherboards too. You don't want old, you want new, right? So, and I'm not saying it has to be this one, but I'm just saying if you pick this one that came out in 2004, that's 10 years ago. Okay? And the only processors that go out that work with them, if you look at the processor list, you go up to the Core 2 Quad, that's as fast as you go, whereas down here you're looking at much, much faster.
That's a freshman.
Yeah. Okay. During my class though, from now on, go to the office. Office sent you up here because they're all out?
Yeah.
My second block.
Weird one.
Oh, this is a tough book one anyway.
Yeah.
Well, of course they sent you up here. Nobody else can give you this battery. Okay.
I don't want to look at anything.
That's okay. Yep, you're right. I wouldn't even look into those. This is done. I thought these were- And come back during your until you get your laptop. Okay, so my point being, you want to, and also if you look at the speed of these as opposed to the speed of these, there's a phenomenal difference between the two. So let me go and turn that on, and I'm going to move this up. This one here. That's hidden right now. Hide that. I don't want to oversaturate. I don't want to oversaturate you with too many things to see on the sites that we're doing. So
It's still hidden.
I know I hid it on purpose, but I put it in the right section to unhide it when I unhide those things. Okay, so again, as we look at these, we have our back panel connectors, we have our CPU socket, we have our memory slots. I'm going to go to a more current motherboard here. When we look at these, just so you know, just so we get this with an arm and holes is PGA, and therefore it's AMD. And this one, in fact, says AM2, which is one of the AMD sockets. And if we look back here, oh, I didn't even talk about AMD while we were there. Now I hit it again. Let's put it up here. And I need to what? So if I look at my AMD sockets, you can see the now, green one are the AMD sockets. So I've got FM1. These are actually server ones. AM3 and AM2 are the ones that you're, and 2 plus are the ones you're going to see are really the current ones. And the two that you're going to be looking at the most are AM3 plus, which I know came out in 2009, and really the FM1 socket, which is their current one that came out in 2011. That's the one you really want to make sure that you're getting one of those to be the current processor when you look at your motherboards. But they look the same. It looks just like this. Okay?
It
means it's AMD.
Is it easy to tell the difference between the bar and the hook?
Yeah, I'll show you. It's very easy. Here, look. I'll look at the next picture. There's the bar, and there's the hook. I mean, you can really, on a picture, you can see the hook layout really, really, I think, easily. Plus, it's got this metal bracket that goes over it as well. Whereas this one, you just see the CPU, and even if it's empty, even if it's empty, you see the pins, whereas this one's empty, you still see the bracket. See the, to me, it's a very obvious difference between those two, okay? And this one would be an AMD, and this one would be an Intel. I'm gonna put this back in before I end up letting Max spin my. You were the closest one. I'm not saying you would do that, but everyone likes to touch processors when
Wasn't
they
that
come in
on
the
the
room.
first day of school, someone been?
Yes.
That one you lost, right?
Okay, so the answer to your question is I think so. And by the way, there's a plastic cap over this one. That's why you can't see anything. Actually, you would see it even better. This is an unused motherboard that has a little plastic piece over top of it. Okay, so the next thing we need to look at when we're looking at motherboards is the kind of memory. Because we have different kind of memory slots when we look at these. And usually, current motherboards today go in pairs because they use what's called synchronous memory, and they work better if you put in the memory together in pairs. You can put it in any way you want to in today's motherboards. When I started in computers, if you didn't put the memory in the right kind and the right settings, it didn't boot at all. You got no indication, no beeps, no nothing. It's just like black. Nothing happened, okay? Today, if you put in one stick of memory here and one stick of memory in there, as long as the kind of memory that goes with that motherboard, the motherboard's going to boot. It may give you an error. Not optical memory configuration or something like that, saying the word memory in it. Because they have different verbiage for all of them, meant that, hey, dummy, this would work better if you would stick them in next to each other in the same color, okay? That's what the color is for, is to let you know which ones go together. Now, when it comes to memory, there are a number of different kinds of memories, because they have form factors, just like the motherboard does. Everything uses DDR today. When they first came out, DDR worked at 233 megahertz.
That's cool.
And what?
You already did this.
What?
You already explained all this.
Keep going. I didn't.
You might as well just skip this. You already went over.
I didn't write down the first time, Peyton.
You did this once already?
Yeah, no, I didn't.
Yes, you did. Brian just didn't write it down.
You didn't write it down?
You really did explain. I have it written down right
You
here.
did? I already wrote down these numbers?
Yeah,
I have them all right here.
Okay, I guess I'm going crazy. I don't know what I did first block or second block. Leave me alone. Don't pick on me. So I've got the different memory standards that can go in here, so I have to make sure that I get the right one. If I go and buy a gamer motherboard that takes DDR2, I've made a horrific mistake. You want DDR3. If I'm trying to make the fastest computer for my gamer one, now if I bought DDR2 for oh, I gotta send out memory. I sold some memory and I keep forgetting to send out. If I just send out memory. Lol memory. Okay. So we have to make sure we get the right one. If I've got DDR2 for the home one, I don't care. It's going to be fast enough, right? It goes up to what megahertz? DDR2? DDR2?
400 to 800.
800, it goes as fast as 800. Okay, it started out 400, it goes as fast as 800. This one takes 800 megahertz DDR2. Okay, in fact, it won't even work in anything that's not 667 or 800. This motherboard will not slow down to 533 or 400. Because when I said 400, 800, there's a whole bunch in between there. It didn't go whoop and double. Okay, it came out at 400, then it went to 533, then it went to 667, then it turned into 800. This one only takes 667 or 800. So if you buy the wrong motherboard, and the first one, by the way, you have to stick with it, you're stuck. Unless I say specifically, you better redo this presentation. When you do your motherboard presentation, if you present one that's completely off, that there's no way to be successful the rest of the projects, I will tell you, you have to redo this project. And it may just be that section, and just that motherboard section for that. Okay, but if I don't tell you you have to redo it, you're not allowed to redo it, that's what you're stuck with. Okay, so I got my memory here, and then I got my extra components down here that I need to be able to readily identify, okay? So when I'm gonna talk about some of these, because I've got them marked on here. So these nice long ones with latches on the back are the PCI Express ones. They always have a latch on the back, okay? The latch may look like this, it may be white with a big hook, but these are generally, or can be, very large. Man, I should have brought that in too. I'm bringing my broken video cover. It's ginormous. It goes all the way to the back of here. Okay. If this doesn't latch it in there, it's not going to sit. It's going to come loose. Okay. So they all have a latch. You cannot pull it out without going like that to undo the lock on that. Okay. So when I look at this, I can always see the longest one, and this is the lock back here. That this one has PCI Express 16 or 8, and we'll talk about the different speeds there. But that whole thing means I could get 2 gamer cards in there. These down here are all normal PCI slots. Couldn't tell you why that one's orange without looking at the diagram, because usually they're all this color. And this has 3 standard PCI. PCI stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect. That's a test question. Peripheral Component Interconnect. Peripheral Component Interconnect. Okay? PCI stands for Peripheral. What's peripheral mean?
Peripheral vision, like not on target, but
Not
it's
the
still
main
there.
stuff.
But it's
Okay?
still there.
It means it's not the main stuff. Okay, so main stuff's over here, it's not the main, not a main thing. Component, what's a component?
Part.
Extra thing, okay? Interconnect, in other words, plug, okay? Okay, so it's a spare extra thing plug, okay? So PCI stands for Peripheral Component Interconnect. These are all PCI slots, okay, except for this one, which is an EGP, stands for Advanced Graphic Port, and it was advanced back in 1999, but it's not advanced anymore. Okay, you can't buy those kind of anymore. But so I've got my normal PCI slots, and then this little tiny one, and there is it called a PCI 1, PCI X1, PCI X1, this little tiny one right there. And there are also ones called PCI X2, which are twice as big as PCI X1s, and PCI X4, which are twice as big as that, and then the next side goes 8. And so I can't tell whether this is 8 or 16. What's the number mean? The number means how much faster it is than a PCI X1. So X16 is 16 times faster than this, but you don't know from looking whether it's at X1 or an X8. So I've got these extra slots on here that I need to take into account. Okay, by the way, if I put in a really good video cards are 2 slots wide, that would take up both those. And if I put another one, it'd take up both those. So if I was going to make this a gamer board, I need to say I got one PCI X1 available and 2 PCIs. Because if I put a good gamer card in there, it will clobber that other slot. Okay, just so you know when I'm looking at that. So, but I need to evaluate this and say, what am I using this motherboard for? If I'm using it for a server, I don't care. I've got lots of spots to put extra network cards in there. And then the other thing is these other plugs down here, which are very important, the serial ATA headers. Okay, so I'm going to erase this slide, talk about hard drive connections. Okay, what we have today, we have SATA, which stands for Serial ATA, which is a connector for our hard drives and our CD-ROM. And when these first came out, we had SATA 1. Actually, we had SATA. And then we had SATA 2 connectors. And now we have SATA 3 connectors. So when the SATA 1 came out, it did 150 megabytes per second. Dude, that wrote that completely wrong. Let's pretend. I just put MB so I can't put macro. And then SATA 2 came out and it was 300, and SATA 3 is 600. And you'll also see it as yeah, okay. So 150, 300, and 600. Okay. You also see this written, instead of megabytes per second, you'll see this as 6 gigabits per second as well. But it's the same thing. Okay. Or 3. Okay. So obviously SATA 2 is twice as fast as SATA 1. or SATA. SATA 3 is twice as fast as SATA 2. So when I'm evaluating a motherboard, what kind of SATA connectors do I have? I see I have 6 there. On this motherboard, I have 2 right here. It says SATA 0 and SATA 2. There's spot they could have put a SATA 1 and SATA 3, but they didn't put the plug on there, so there's only 2 on this one. Same thing on this one. This one only has 2 right there. These are SATA 1 connectors. These are SATA 2 connectors. So this SATA goes twice as fast as the other one. Why does that matter? Because if I go and plug in my super duper fast hard drive and plug it in to a SATA connector, when it does SATA 3, how much slower is it? 4 times, Mr. Poole. Yeah, right. It's 4 times slower, right? This times 4 equals this. Did I do my math right? Right, just in case I got 12 times.
Right.
Okay, so it's 4 times faster. 4 times faster, right? Yes.
Why 4 times?
It's
6 gigabytes per second.
what? Am I doing that my math wrong? 150
Oh,
times 2
okay, I
is
get it, I get it, I
300
get it.
times 2 is
I get it.
600. Yeah, I think I got my math right. So it's 4 times faster. So if I plug a brand new hard drive into a SATA port, I've just clobbered it because it can't go faster than that. That's what speed it transfers data. So if I go put a really cool solid state drive into that, it runs like that, not like a solid state drive. So the OS is going to load slow, and my programs are going to load slow. So it matters when I pick out my motherboard what kind of SATA connector I have on there as well. Okay. Now this motherboard, right there, has 2 different kinds of SATA connectors. And the reason I say that is because they're color coded, and that's what they do. They color code them. I have 2 different kinds of SATA connectors, and I would guess from looking at this that I have 4 SATA 2s and 2 SATA 3s. Be a guess, but it would probably be a good guess. Okay, and this might be great because if I have a solid state drive, I can plug it in there. If I have old CD-ROM, I can plug it in there. I have options, right? So when I pick my motherboard, I also have to look at that. So looking at this one, I've got 2 different pairings of memory. I like this one, by the way, better than the other one. Why? Because I got space. Because if I put in 2 together here, they're way far apart. So I put 2 together in the other one, they're right next to each other, and that causes heat. The last thing I want to do is to put, and this one's the same thing, see, they just made the snaps different. So these 2 white ones are the ones that get filled, or the 2 black ones for best performance. And they'd be that far apart. Whereas these right next to each other are going to cause a heat issue. Okay, I got 2 high-end video cards, and I can tell by the little snaps these are actually hard to get out. You have to push the little plunger button to unlock that one. And if you got a big video card, sometimes it's hard to hit that. What am I doing on time? How much we got left? We're almost done. We're almost done because we're going to tear apart PCs today too.
On your hard drives.
Okay.
6.
So this one will hold 6 hard drives. Okay. Now there's another kind of connector that came out. It came out before SATA, and it's called PATA. And it stands for Parallel ATA. It's a different plug entirely. This is a IDE cable.
Oh God, no.
Okay.
It's the devil cable.
Uses an IDE cable. It's just like this. Okay. It plugs in to the motherboard and allows up to 2 things to be plugged into each cable. The only thing we use PATA for anymore in school, you still need to know how to hook it up because you need to know how to hook it up, is CD-ROM drives. That's the only thing connecting PATAs up in school. Okay. PATAs went at speeds of 33, 66, 100, and some made it up to 133 meg. Okay, but this is what most of them were. Okay, so if SATA was started at 150 and then the 300 and now it's 600, we're talking about 6 times speed over a normal PATA device, which is why we spent a lot of time last year getting rid of every PATA hard drive in the school. That's why some of the computers, you have the exact same computer right next to each other. We had this today on these that were in Mr. Wassom's lab. if one of them's got a PATA drive and one of them's got a SATA 2 drive, why is this one so much faster? It's the exact same computer. Okay, it is the same computer. It's a totally different hard drive. So this one would load way, way faster. They had SATA 2, so 3 times faster hard drive read rates and transfer rates than a PATA connection. So if you've got a computer at home, just like this one took, and we had to use them, okay? This one took 2 PATA connectors, because one cable gave you 2, and had 2 SATAs. If you have the option, even this really old motherboard had SATA connectors. If you look at your computer and see it's using a PATA hard drives are only $40. I would get a SATA one in there and get yourself a major increase in speed. Okay? And you put a SATA one in, put a solid state drive, and then it'd be a crazy difference. Okay?
These are super PATA.
Which is what's the worst thing about that laptop right there, that D600 laptop right there. There's nothing wrong with that laptop, other than it has a PATA connector. I can't put a solid state drive in it. If I could put a solid state drive in that laptop would be totally usable today, because it was a really fast laptop. It's only single core, it's not great, but we definitely could use it for elementary school or middle school use and put it in a cart. I've got a whole cart full of them. I tried to make them run off flash drives. It's the great one.
Yeah.
But it only takes IDE drives, and nobody makes an IDE solid state drive. Why? Because you go make this huge fast solid state drive and then plug it in at this rate. They're like, why would you want that? I'd still like it because it's still better than a PATA drive. But anyway, so that's the other kind of connector, and it looks very similar to this connector right here, which is a different connector altogether. This one has no PATA on it. That is a floppy disk drive connector. And the floppy disk drive connector looks very, very similar, but not the same. Okay? Bigger, little. Actually, that's not it either. Isn't it? Where is the font? Doesn't have it. Doesn't have it. There we go. This one does. Bigger and littler. See, it's just a little bit littler. The width of the cable is the same. Or, I don't know what you call this. The thickness of the cable is the same, but this one has 34 pins and this has 40, so it's a little bit smaller than this. And when we unplug our computers today, we'll see what we're talking about. So this one has 2 PATA connectors, a floppy disk drive connector, and then 2 SATAs over there as well. Okay. So these are all decisions we have to look at when we're looking at our motherboards and deciding later on what motherboards we're going to buy. Because basically you're going to do the same thing. In this one, it's just like my one I did for the power. You're going to represent a company. Max has Gigabyte, okay? And then he's going to have to present 3 gigabyte motherboards. 1 gigabyte for the home, 1 gigabyte for the business, and 1 gigabyte for the gamer. And this is, by the way, the longest research part of the project you have to do, because it's the other one that you presented 3. Okay? It's the other reason this one takes a little more time. So as I look at this, those are the kind of things that I need to look at on my motherboard when I'm making that decision. This is an example of one with a gamer video card. This has a crossfire connector right here that makes these 2 video cards work as one. Both these take up double slots, so that's 4 slots on the back of your computer foul. And so what else can I plug in? I've got 1 spot left here for PCI 1. I don't know why there's 2 openings. And then maybe there's one other thing back over here, but sometimes if you're doing a gamer, that's why you want a bigger case. That's why you want more slots, because you end up fouling up slots when you put them in. And that's where I wanted to stop today on the lecture part of it. What we're going to do now is, I want you guys to put away your laptops. We're going to get out some ATX cases. We're going to go through the internals of the case, and we're going to disconnect everything inside the case. So what I want you guys to do right now, why isn't this stopping?